The call came in the early morning of May 2nd, 1972. John Edgar Hoover, the first and only director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, was dead. But in the corridors of power in Washington, D.C., the news was met not with grief, but with a surge of cold, electric fear. An urgent question passed in hushed tones through the White House, the halls of Congress, and the highest echelons of government. It wasn't about succession. It wasn't about the nation's security. It was about a filing cabinet. Where were the files? Who had them? And what secrets did they hold? For 48 years, one man had been the most feared person in America, not because he carried a gun, but because he carried information. Now, the architect of secrets was gone, and the race to control his legacy, or to destroy it, had begun. To understand the power J. Edgar Hoover would one day wield, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to understand his obsession with order. He wasn't a charismatic field agent, kicking down doors. He was a creature of the archives, a bureaucrat. Born and raised in Washington, D.C., the city of paper and power, he was instilled with a rigid Victorian morality. He was meticulous, punctual, fastidious. His suits were always pressed, his shoes always shined. He never married. He lived with his mother until she died. His entire life was the Bureau. He was the Bureau. When Hoover took over the ramshackle Bureau of Investigation in 1924, it was a small, corrupt, and ineffective agency, a political dumping ground. Hoover, then just 29 years old, saw not a mess, but a blank slate, an opportunity to build something in his own image, disciplined, centralized, efficient, and clean. He fired agents he deemed unqualified or immoral. He instituted strict codes of conduct. But his true genius, the foundation of his entire empire, was his passion for information. He didn't just want to solve crimes, he wanted to catalog reality. He created the Central Records System, a revolutionary cross-referencing index where any name, any organization, any event could be retrieved in minutes. Every clue, every lead, every whisper from an informant was typed onto an index card and filed away. It was the great methodical brain of the FBI, and Hoover was its sole consciousness. In a world without computers, he was building a human search engine fueled by secrets. But early in his tenure, Hoover made a discovery, a profound and dangerous realization that would change the course of American history. His agents, in their pursuit of gangsters, saboteurs, and communists, were collecting more than just evidence. They were collecting lives. In the margins of their reports, on wiretap transcripts, in informant gossip, were the details that couldn't be used in a courtroom. Financial troubles, medical ailments, sexual peccadillos, illicit affairs. The quiet, messy, human vulnerabilities of powerful people. To any other lawman, this was trash, inadmissible noise. To Hoover, it was treasure. There wasn't one single day he decided to build a blackmail library. It was a gradual slide, a moral corrosion. It began with a simple act of separation. When a piece of particularly sensitive information crossed his desk, something scandalous about a congressman, a judge, a cabinet member, he would mark it. He'd instruct his most trusted secretary, a woman named Helen Gandy, to start a new file, a special file. It wouldn't go into the Central Records System, where it could be requested or subpoenaed. It would go into his private office suite. At first, he told himself it was to protect the Bureau from scandal,
to keep sensitive, unverified gossip from tainting official records. But soon the collection grew, and so did its purpose. It became an insurance policy, a weapon to be kept in reserve, a system of control that ran parallel to the American system of justice.
While the FBI had its official files, J. Edgar Hoover had his own, and the power he derived from them would make him a permanent, immovable fixture in the heart of the American government. For the next 4 decades, Hoover's power grew in the dark, nurtured by whispers and recorded on paper. The America that celebrated him on newsreels, the square-jawed G-man who took down John Dillinger and hunted Nazi spies, never saw the other Hoover, the man who sat in his office poring over transcripts of illicit liaisons and illegal wiretaps. The system he created was ingenious in its simplicity. Agents in the field would send sensitive gossip or illegally obtained information directly to Hoover's office, bypassing normal channels. Hoover would review it. If it was potent enough, it was handed to Helen Gandy. This quiet, fiercely loyal woman was the sole gatekeeper of what became known within the director's inner circle as the official and confidential files. This is the one thing you must understand. These were not FBI files. They were Hoover's files. They were stored in a dozen locked 2-drawer filing cabinets in Helen Gandy's anteroom, just feet from Hoover's own desk. They contained no bureau markings. Their contents were indexed by a system known only to her and the director. It was a government-funded, privately controlled intelligence agency of one, and he used it with surgical precision. The threats were almost never explicit. Hoover was too shrewd for that. He preferred the subtle gesture, a friendly lunch with a senator, during which he'd casually mention that he was aware of the senator's gambling problem. A phone call to a publisher, expressing concern that one of his muckraking reporters was associating with known subversives. The message was always clear: I know, and I never forget. Presidents, who technically had the authority to fire him, quickly learned the rules of the game. When Harry Truman considered replacing Hoover, a friendly visitor from the Bureau stopped by the White House. He delivered a dossier detailing the financial misconduct of some of Truman's closest associates. Truman backed down. The director stayed. Dwight Eisenhower was briefed on Hoover's file about an affair he'd allegedly had during World War II. Eisenhower never challenged the director again. Lyndon Johnson, perhaps the most politically cunning of all, chose to make Hoover an ally. LBJ would use Hoover's information against his own political enemies, once marveling, "I'd rather have him inside the tent pissing out than outside pissing in." But even Johnson lived in fear of what the director knew about him. It wasn't a partnership, it was a ceasefire. But Hoover's crusade went beyond political maneuvering. It became personal. And no one drew his ire, his obsessive, pathological hatred, more than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. To Hoover, Dr. King represented everything he despised: a challenge to the social order, a supposed moral leader who, Hoover's illegal bugs revealed, had his own human frailties, including extramarital affairs. For Hoover, this hypocrisy was an unforgivable sin. He saw King not as a civil rights leader, but as a dangerous fraud, possibly manipulated by communists who threatened the American way of life. He unleashed the full, covert force of the FBI against him. Agents bugged his hotel rooms, tapped his phones, and placed informants inside his inner circle.
They gathered hundreds of hours of recordings, not for any criminal investigation, but for a personal smear campaign. This culminated in one of the most shameful acts in the Bureau's history. In late 1964, as King was preparing to accept the Nobel Peace Prize, an anonymous package arrived at his office. It contained a tape, a compilation of audio from Hoover's bugs, and a letter. The letter, written by an FBI agent on Hoover's orders, was a torrent of vile accusations. It called King an evil, abnormal beast, and it ended with a terrifying suggestion. It said, "King, there is only one thing left for you to do. You know what it is. You are done. There is but one way out for you." It was a poison pen note from the United States government, implicitly urging a Nobel laureate to kill himself. Dr. King was shaken, but he refused to be intimidated. He knew who it was from. The message wasn't for him alone. It was a demonstration of Hoover's reach, a warning that no one, not even a man of God, was beyond the grasp of his files. The ultimate confrontation, however, was not with a civil rights leader, but with the one man who held Hoover's fate in his hands, the Attorney General of the United States. In 1961, that man was Robert F. Kennedy.
Bobby Kennedy was young, idealistic, and deeply distrustful of the aging director. As his boss, he tried to shift the Bureau's priorities away from hunting communists and towards fighting organized crime, something Hoover had long pretended didn't exist. The two men circled each other like wary predators. The tension came to a head over the files. Kennedy knew they existed. He knew Hoover used them to intimidate his brother, the president, John F. Kennedy, whose own reckless affairs were a source of constant, terrifying vulnerability. Robert Kennedy understood that as long as those files existed, Hoover was untouchable. In one now legendary meeting, Kennedy confronted Hoover directly. He told him he wanted access to the confidential files. He was the Attorney General. They were technically his to see. Hoover sat behind his massive desk, impassive. He didn't argue, he didn't shout, he didn't need to. He simply looked at the Attorney General and, according to witnesses, calmly replied that he could of course see any files he wished. Then he added a casual, chilling remark. He mentioned that he was also in the process of creating a new file on a certain powerful man who was having an affair with the wife of a Chicago mobster, an affair the president himself had been involved in. The man he was referring to was Sam Giancana. The woman was Judith Campbell Exner. The powerful man was not some obscure official. He was staring right at him. Hoover was talking about Bobby Kennedy's own brother, the President of the United States. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room was absolute. Robert Kennedy, the second most powerful man in the country, was silenced. He knew he had been checkmated. He could not fire Hoover. He could not seize the files. To do so would risk the ruin of his brother's presidency and his family's name. The director had won. He was accountable to no one. J. Edgar Hoover died in his sleep, holding all of his secrets. And the moment he was gone, the institution he had so fiercely protected immediately turned to erasing his most dangerous legacy. The order didn't come from the White House. It came from within the director's own office. Helen Gandy, his loyal secretary for over 5 decades, knew exactly what to do. She had her instructions. As the nation mourned the public hero, Gandy began the quiet, methodical destruction of the private tyrant's arsenal. She locked the door to her office.
For days, stretching into weeks, she went through the 48 years of secrets, one folder at a time. She didn't read them. She said later her only job was to destroy them as fast as I could. She shredded some. She carted others away in boxes to Hoover's home to be burned. When investigators from the Justice Department, sent by a panicked Nixon administration, finally arrived to secure the files, they found nothing.
Gandy told them they never existed. The official and confidential files, the leverage that had bent the will of 8 presidents and countless public figures, had vanished into smoke and dust. We will never know the full extent of what was in them. What scandals were averted? What careers were ruined? What darkness lay at the heart of the men who ran the country? Helen Gandy took those secrets with her to her own grave. Hoover's legacy is one of profound and disturbing duality. He built the FBI into the world's premier law enforcement agency, pioneering techniques that are still used today. He brought forensic science into the mainstream. He created a sense of order and security for millions of Americans during a tumultuous half-century. But he did so by violating the very laws he swore to uphold. He used the power of the state to persecute his personal enemies and the shield of national security to hide his crimes. He crippled the civil rights movement, intimidated dissent, and fostered a culture of secrecy and paranoia that rotted the federal government from the inside. After his death, Congress passed a law. Never again would one person be allowed to accumulate so much unchecked power. From now on, the director of the FBI would be limited to a single 10-year term. It's a quiet legislative monument to the man who ruled for 48. In the end, J. Edgar Hoover, the man obsessed with files, with records, with creating a permanent account of other men's sins, had his own darkest chapter almost entirely erased. But his story serves as a permanent, chilling warning that in a democracy, the person who holds the secrets often holds the power, and that the most dangerous threats to liberty sometimes come not from foreign enemies, but from the quiet patriot in the office down the hall, who believes he is protecting the nation by holding it hostage. This file is now closed. But the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.